is taking the career scenic route. I'm going to say a few words about that, and obviously a few words about our speakers in a few minutes. And we'll do our usual icebreaker thing, but if I could just start with a couple of key housekeeping items. If I could just ask, if you're not speaking or not presenting today, just for the time being, do you mind turning your camera off and also putting yourself on mute, just so that we can see all of our speakers properly and focus on our panel members. There will be time for the Q&A later, and obviously we'd really love to see and hear from all of you and have that engagement on our topic later on today. Let me start us off then with a little bit of an icebreaker just while we wait for everybody to join. And so we're just really keen to understand a little bit more around career paths and career journeys today. So our question and our icebreaker topic, just for a few simple reflections in the chat, is: has your career path turned out as expected? So please put your comments in the chat on there. Let me just pop the question in as well. I hope you can see all of that. And just while we're waiting for some reflections, if I don't mind just reiterating some of the housekeeping points. If you're not speaking or presenting, just keep your cameras off, and then we can focus on our presenters, and obviously on mute as well. We'll have some Q&A time later on. Okay, so I'll just wait for some of the themes to come through. I've got a little bit of an echo at my end, so if there are people who are not on mute, that would be fab, just to keep the audio going. That's great. Thank you. So lots of kind of reflections in the chat around career paths not turning out as expected. I think that's a little bit of a theme. Who can plan for these things? There's far too many things that are unexpected that are going to crop up along the way. I like Helen Royal's response: never imagined I would end up in finance. Yeah, I'm not sure I did either, but it's a very interesting reflection for a finance network, isn't it? I'm not sure that I can see anybody, or maybe one or two people, who have actually planned out their career and it has worked exactly as they thought, but you never know. It's a really interesting set of reflections there. Thank you for sharing your thoughts there. I'm sure we'll reflect on some of those themes as we go through the webinar today. So just again, conscious a few people are just in the process of joining. Welcome to our Women in Leadership for Finance webinar today. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't met for a few months. We had a summer break, although we did have our massively successful face-to-face event in London in July, which I'm now calling it an annual event since we've had two now, so no pressure for July 2025. This has actually informed the theme for today's webinar, and I'll come back to that in a minute. For those that don't know me, I'm Sarah Griffiths. I'm the Deputy Regional Director of Finance in NHS England in the East, and together with Nicola Brooks, I co-lead this network. Those of you who've joined us before will know by now, normally we will have heard quite a bit from Nicola at the start of our sessions. Today you can probably see her, but we won't be able to hear from her, unfortunately, today. She's struggling with a cough and no voice, so we'll hear her but not see her, and I hope Nick's feeling very better soon. She's definitely here with us and engaging. As I mentioned earlier, the theme for the webinar today is taking the career scenic route. We're joined by two panel members, Margaret Pratt and Caroline Atkinson, and we've always got awesome speakers in these sessions. Today's no exception. Margaret and Caroline are going to introduce themselves in a couple of minutes, but let me just say they're both massively inspirational individuals. Both had very varied and exciting careers in the sector, both within the NHS and outside of the NHS, and some really challenging situations to reflect on along the way. I mentioned that today was informed by our face-to-face event in London. So those of you who are able to join us would have listened to Professor Bola Owolabi's opening session. She covered loads of things, but one area really stood out and it ran as a theme for the remainder of the day. And it was linked to our career paths and our career choices. What Bola explained to us is things don't always turn out as expected. We don't all have to climb a career ladder and to achieve what we want to achieve in our careers. What we can do that's equally as fulfilling is take what she coined a phrase of the scenic route. So move around, take different opportunities as they present themselves, and fundamentally get to where you want to go to via the scenic route without a very clear, straight career ladder. We thought that was a really interesting and a really important topic to reflect on, and so we're going to continue with that discussion today. So we'll get started. So Margaret, Caroline, can I ask both of you please to just introduce yourself, give a little bit of a brief history on your career journey and where you're working now, just by way of a starter. So Margaret, do you want to go first, please?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for those kind words. And so, because I'm more than a bit of a dinosaur, I'm going to start with a reflection that you can't look at today through yesterday's eyes, or you can't look at yesterday's through today's eyes either. And when I was preparing for this, I realized really the past is a foreign country, and yet that past has made me informed where I got to and how I got there. So if I step back to when I was where I grew up, it's a vanished era. It was a rural upbringing, a home in a village, no pavements, a walk to primary school on my own, walk back to lunch on my own, and then later with my sister. A father who had felt that if his wife was to work, it would have been a reflection on his inability to support his wife and family. So in that sense, gender was normalized. Gender discrimination, particularly for my mother, was normalized. Kinder and Kuchen, not just for my parents' generation, but the knock-on effect to me, and also, of course, I was inheriting that with my employers as well, because they too were of that generation. And the reason for telling you that story is that for me, being able to work, being able to have a career was and is and continues to be the most enormous privilege. I work because I want to, not, and increasingly now, not because I have to. So, and I know Caroline will say similar things about being the first person to university, but in my case, after I graduated, I had to have a job. And again, there wasn't the history of you have a career, you got a job. So later on, my first job, I was an accounts clerk, and there were two grades for women. There were clerks and there were senior clerks, and senior clerks got £2 a week more than clerks. I was a clerk. I applied for a graduate training scheme, and again, looking back, it didn't feel discriminatory at the time, but in the end, after about a third attempt, I became Solihull's first Metropolitan Council's first graduate trainee, and I was on my way. And I worked in local government. In the end, by my early 30s, I suppose I was an assistant county treasurer. My next step would have been to be a deputy county treasurer, except women weren't deputy county treasurers. And of course, we had to manage a two-career family, and that too will be something I guess resonates now, trying to manage geographically a two-career family. it just isn't straightforward, and it plays to that scenic route. So that at that point, I made the decision to go into management consultancy in the firms. And it was like a finishing school because I learned a whole new set of skills and techniques around being solutions based, problem solving, only dealing with problems, presentation skills, relationship management, management risk. And I did all sorts of really interesting things like, will water float? So I was part of that privatization. Sorry, the sun's come out. There we are. Try that. So after probably about 7 years, it started to be the case that I felt responsibility and accountability needed to be more aligned, that you were responsible for a project, but you weren't ever accountable for it. So I came back as a director of finance into health, and health from then on has become my industry. Along with a lot of negotiation with auditors over going concerns and reports in the public interest, I've specialised, I suspect, in turnaround before turnaround was even a word, really. But my other reflection is that career routes are never motorways, or rarely motorways. There are single track paths and digressions via footpaths and various other sorts of routes. So in parallel with my day jobs, I'd been involved with SIPFA as a volunteer throughout. And that's where really the stuff around being helped along my way helped so much. I sat at the feet of a lot of great men, borough treasurers, county treasurers. They all were men, and I learnt so much just from listening to their conversations. I built a great network of peers and peer support that I still have and I still benefit from. I hope I give a bit back on that now. And eventually I was elected as the first woman president of SIPFA in the late 90s. The cynical would say they wanted a skirt, but actually it's an accolade for me that no one can ever take away, and also to the people who supported me on that journey. But then after the presidential year, when you're just an ambassador and you do the day's job the best you can round it, you can never go backwards. And it was at that point I decided there were real difficulties in the Worcestershire Health Authority around me as a president in a financially challenged organisation. I left Worcestershire and then I set up on my own. Thanks to peers for their support in all of this. I went for a portfolio career of self-employment and also non-executive roles, all very different, but really so much learning. And that's broadly what I've done ever since. I'm now, I've got a couple of a couple of NHS non-executive appointments, but some other non-executive stuff that I do. I'm also do financial governance assessments for NHS England, 3 or 4 regions. There are moments I'm embedded in CQC teams for that. It's a really different lens. There are moments when I think I know more and more about less and less, but on the other hand, I'm drawing on these varied experiences that I've had throughout my career. What I'm for is doing things right and doing the right things, and that's at the nub of governance. Over years, I've developed a lot of experience about people's quirks and how to get over difficult ground as effectively and as painlessly, it doesn't always feel painless, as possible. And so while I'm frequently disappointed in what I see, I am actually rarely surprised, because leadership in any form, finance just happens to be my specialism. I'm very rarely surprised. There's very little I haven't seen in some form before. I'm still learning and I'm still enjoying what I do. And so I'm very blessed. Yeah, I'm really, really fortunate. I hope that gives you a brief pen portrait that those of you who know me will recognise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Yes, it absolutely does. And there's a number of things I'm sure we'll come back to with some specific questions soon. Let me hand over now to Caroline, if that's okay, for a brief intro. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Margaret. That's quite something to follow, so let me try my best. So I'm Caroline Atkinson. I'm currently interim Deputy CFO for Strategy and Improvement at King's. Just, I suppose, a brief overview of my career. So I was the first of my family to uni. I studied chemistry at Oxford. I did a gap year, as you do, joined a professional services firm and stayed there for 10 years and progressed up to senior manager level. And then I joined Monitor and moved through Monitor in various different levels, from senior manager up to improvement director, as we evolved from Monitor to NHSE. And then I've joined King's as I say, as deputy CFO. So that's the really brief career outline, and it hides a number of things which I'm going to sort of explain in a little bit more detail now, because that's the very linear view, but actually that's been quite a scenic pathway as we're discussing along the way. So the first piece, as Margaret says, first in my family to go to university. And so I think what that meant for me was I'm incredibly driven, and I think always have been, but probably, I suppose, a flip side of that, which I've been reflecting on, is that sort of perhaps lack of role models. As I was coming through, my parents met at Cookery College. In fact, my dad was probably the first ambassador for you can do anything, because he had to fight his school in order to take cookery and home economics when he was in the 1960s. So the flip side, I suppose, of some of what we perhaps experience at times now has existed in all ways. So he's always been very keen for me to know I can do anything, which I think has been, as both my parents have, which has been incredibly, I feel incredibly grateful for. But academically, I was pretty much on my own from a very early stage. And so I did crack on, but it does mean that I have a slight tendency to be less good at asking for help. And that lack of role models, I think, has at times meant it's been a little bit trickier to identify and navigate some of the situations that I perhaps found myself in. I like the question around, did you expect to be doing what you're doing today? I mean, I left school. The only thing I knew I didn't want to do was to become an accountant, having done some young enterprise, some accountancy in young enterprise, and I hated it. I found it incredibly difficult and said, I'm definitely not doing that. I'm going to win the Nobel Prize for chemistry. So that's what I went off to do. I didn't really enjoy experiments. And so I realized that Nobel Prize wasn't really going to come in my direction. And so I took some time out. And I think that year out for me was incredibly helpful, because I gained in confidence by doing something totally different and recognizing that I could do something totally different. In this case, it was teaching English in China. But my goodness, yeah, I felt like a different person in confidence levels coming back. And I was able, I think, on the back of that, to have some experience that enabled me to get that first break into a graduate career. I was 10 years in professional services, and I got so much experience from it. I learned absolutely tons. And I probably was on more of what would be seen as a linear career pathway, I think, at that point. But then external factors influenced, particularly the recession of 2008, some loss of some big contracts, particularly around the Audit Commission contracts, which meant that the way in which we were delivering work fundamentally changed. And so the leadership of our department was also changing. And perhaps I didn't recognise it as much at the time, but those shifts externally sort of meant that my ability to progress upwards was getting, you know, anyone's ability to progress upwards at that point was becoming more tricky. So what that helped with was reflecting on, well, what do I want out of life? And I think that was a really helpful reflection at that point in life, and led me to some different decisions around my career. And I joined Monitor. It was a sideways move into a senior manager role. But health wasn't something I'd massively worked in before. So it was quite a learning curve at that point, which I was massively up for, but certainly was something that, if you're talking about taking the scenic route, that certainly provided a bit of a scene as I started to learn about health. I was also really lucky to go on to comment not long after that into Chelsea and Westminster as head of strategy. Again, a massive, amazing learning curve. And that was fantastic, and probably was an opportunity potentially at the time to stay around and again progress upwards. But I wanted a baby, and I was on terms and conditions that weren't NHS terms and conditions. And so, you know, I made what for me was an absolute no-brainer, which was to stay on the terms and conditions I was on and be able to have mat leave, which, you know, our family needed at the time in order to start a family. So went back to NHSEI at that point, and started our family, which was fantastic. And I suppose I sort of thought, well, you know, what I'll do next is have a couple of kids and then see what's next for the career. But sadly, we weren't able to do that because I had multiple miscarriages, and that really created a challenge in thinking about career, because frankly I didn't really care about my career at that point. What I cared about was having a job that I could go to and take the mind off of everything that was going on outside of it. And so, you know, the job was incredibly important, and what I kept focused on at that point was, how do I just make sure that, you know, I'm building my experience, building my career. And that's what I did over that period of time. And eventually we came out of that. And a pandemic hit. So that created another external challenge in terms of, what does that mean for my, oh God, it didn't really matter what it meant for my career, did it? But that all got paused in the context of everything else that was going on. But in focusing on, what am I doing next? What can I add value to? How do I focus on the next big project? What I found was I sort of perhaps more slowly moved into a director position within NHSE as an improvement director. And again, I just kept taking the opportunities as they came up. And that's pretty much where I find myself today, as I say, as the interim deputy CFO at King's. So that's my background and story.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for the transparency as well. And again, some really inspiring things in there, and certainly some things we'll pick up through our next sets of conversations in the next 35 minutes or so. So thank you again. What I thought we could do now is just pick up some of those themes. So I've got a couple of questions, if it's okay, that I'm going to ask of Caroline and Margaret, just to kind of pick out some of those key themes. And then while I'm doing that, we're going to sort of do that maybe for the next 10-15 minutes and then open up more broadly for questions. So please do think of what you might want to ask our panel members, pop some comments in the chat. It's really interesting reading some of the chat comments as well. So thank you for those. But I just want to pick up on one theme that you've both mentioned, just to kind of explore it a little bit more. So you've both referenced challenges, obstacles within career journeys, and it's something that we do often come back to through these webinars. So it'd be really helpful to just talk through, perhaps we'll start with you, Margaret, if it's okay, some of the, I guess, the significant obstacles, challenges that you have encountered in your career, and how have you overcome them? And maybe a little bit around the mindset. What might you do differently these days? What support or advice would you offer to somebody else in the same position? It would be helpful if we can have a little bit of a chat through in that space.
I think that's a really interesting view, particularly the mindset point, and the obstacles are generally, I think, about one's principles, one's ethics, one's principles, what you will put up with, and what are outside your red lines, and what you do about that when they are outside your red lines. And the most liberating moment.
I hope this will not spoil too much.
Sorry,
just ask people to go on mute. Thank you. Sorry, Margaret.
Sorry. And so, and the most liberating moment that I had in my career was when I paid off the mortgage. And if I gave one piece of advice to anyone in a senior role who's put under pressure to do something that they are professionally and ethically not comfortable with, it's to be sure that you have a level of financial independence as a family unit or as an individual, whatever, that you are able to make those choices. The people I mean, I don't throw mud at anyone, but I can see how difficult it must be if by taking an ethical and principled stance, like any whistleblower, if you then lose family security, and it picks up what are the most important things in life. As Caroline was saying, it's personal to you, but take steps to protect those things that are most personal to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Caroline, is there anything you want to build on, add on in that space?
Yeah, and I think it absolutely does build on that. And I think it's, for me, when I made decisions to sort of significantly change aspects of my career, it was always about what are my values and how are they working in the context of the job, the career that I'm in at the moment, and by reflecting on that, because we spend such a long time at work, such a huge portion of our life at work, it really does impact on all aspects of life when that's not working properly. But also sometimes you can be a little bit of a boiled crab and not necessarily notice it. Sometimes you just have to take stock and say, actually, is this still the right place? And that can take a little time. It doesn't come overnight. Oh, actually, let's think about that. Right, I've made a decision, but in thinking about it, I think that does help.
Thank you. Thanks. No, agree. I'm not sure I like the boiled crab analogy. I don't know what you mean.
I'm sure
exactly. I'm gonna think just sort of like shift a little bit. So really interesting, Caroline, hearing around your father's reflections growing up and his career choices, and obviously what was considered normal then. Just want to kind of pick up that theme around. Did either of you feel any pressure to move your career in a certain direction or at a certain pace? Did you bow to that pressure? Did you not bow to that pressure? And any reflections or thoughts or experiences there to call out? Do you want to go first, Caroline?
Yeah, happy to. So I think I can honestly say no. I don't feel like I felt under pressure to take my career in one direction or another. Certainly not external pressure. Put quite a lot of pressure on myself. But I think that is, I think that does come from a combination of, as Margaret said, we're all, we're I can't remember your exact terminology, Margaret, but we're all features of our past. We're all features of how we've sort of grown up, etc. And I was very much brought up in you can do anything, which I think even in the 90s was probably, it sort of was there, but I think it was still emerging. I think perhaps because you know, because I was the first, I just don't feel the pressure to do anything in particular. And wherever I end up is where I end up, and I'm quite comfortable with that. But I appreciate it's not the same for everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's helpful. Margaret?
Yes, it's exactly the same. I don't feel under pressure, but my observation was that with the great men with whom I was privileged to work with, they were of my father's generation, and they, in their day jobs, they were pretty sexist until their daughters went to university and post-university. And I can recall one very clear conversation, how disgraceful it was that my daughter isn't getting the opportunity she should be getting. So it was almost, there was that moment of divorce that is one thing in my office, but entirely different when it's my daughter. And I think that did break a lot of it helped break their ceilings in a sense, and caused them to take stock, not rubbing anyone's nose in it, but just they realized the mismatch between their office lives and their personal views.
Yeah. And having that real world scenario played out as well in terms of their own circumstances.
Yes.
We hear a lot about that. We hear a lot about role modeling of behaviours and things like that, which is really, really crucial in this space. Thank you. Let me think. So one of the things that you've both spoken about, I mean, Margaret in particular, you know, I'm not sure how many different jobs you have at the moment, but obviously an awful lot to try and balance across one another. How do you get that balance? Is there any particular approach that you take, you know, in terms of balancing the multiple demands on time, as well as kind of, you know, your own personal work-life balance as well? Margaret, is there anything you can share in that space for us?
Well, I think with work-life balance, you never get it right. Your aspiration is to get it less wrong. I'm in a very fortunate position because I work every day. But on the other hand, if I want to go out for an afternoon, I can do that too. That's the joy of the flexibility of the portfolio career, that if I decide, I think you have to put boundaries around it, and you want to say, no, I'm not going to be available on Monday. And then, but you're the one that makes that. You just said, well, regrettably, could we look for another day? But there are some fixed points, board meetings, in my case with the NHSE work, the inspections, and well, I'm on my own, so I can do that. Going back, when it was the two career families, I used to down tools, close a business on a Friday, and then pick it up again on a Monday morning. The moment comes, I think, for everyone where just with emails, you have to catch up at some point over the weekend and just have to rule, just so that when Monday morning starts, you know what's going on. It's no surprises, and that's probably as much a personal observation as a business observation. But that's true of most of my friends, that you put boundaries around it, but actually there's probably at a senior level you have to put probably an afternoon in over the weekend, just so that you hit the week running. Would you say the same, Caroline?
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with the boundaries, and I don't always get that right. But I have some certain fixed points and certain boundaries.
I think we might have just lost Caroline for a moment. I know. Are you back, Caroline?
I think you might be on mute. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I know you're joining on your phone. Do you want to just try one more? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so I definitely agree on the boundaries. I think, yeah, as I said, I think sometimes they don't hold as firm as you'd want them to. But the question is, if they're not holding that firm once or twice, that's fine. If it's a consistent thing, then something needs to be reevaluated. I mean, I think for me and my family, a key point was, myself and my husband both went part-time when I first went back to work. So we both did 4 days a week, and we've sort of upped that over time. So we now basically both do 4.5 days a week, or flex it over 4.5 days a week, so we can do drop-offs and pickups as needed at home. And that's really important to me, that I do 3 drop-offs a week and 2 pickups a week. Clubs outside of school are a lifesaver. I'm trying to navigate which clubs the child wants to go to with which friends. That's definitely something that takes up quite a bit of time, because if he's happy, then I can be happier. And I think I think it's also about, there is going to be some work outside of work, that, as Margaret says, that is the nature of the roles. The question is, can it be done within fixed periods that I can work around everything else? And if it becomes more than that, then that's something that I need to reevaluate, and what do we need to change in order to make that happen?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, helpful reflections. Yeah, and I'm definitely recognise that, and trying to set the boundaries and trying to keep them is sometimes a different thing. But yes, it's a journey, and I think we're all just trying to do what we can. I'm going to ask you both one more question from me, if that's okay, before we ask our audience for some more. So I just wanted to understand a little bit about kind of support. So obviously everybody benefits from support at times in their career. Is there anything you want to call out in terms of what support's been really valuable for yourselves over your career so far? What advice or similar might you offer to others, and maybe those starting off in their career, or maybe struggling with some of the themes and issues that we've already spoken about today? I don't mind. Caroline, do you want to go first, maybe?
I think on that one, there's definitely been a few notable people that I can kind of point to in my head over the course of my career that have been, sponsor's not quite the right word, but someone that's really supported me to think differently, or to think about how to navigate situations perhaps I was less familiar with. And really been sort of been able to sort of provide really helpful feedback at times that supported me in confidence, and supported in how you might navigate the next phase. So I can definitely point in my head to and interestingly, and this may just be complete coincidence, but quite a number of them have been female. And I think there is something about having people that have sort of literally experienced the same sort of things that you've experienced, to be able to say, well, when I was doing it, I could think about this and doing this and the other. It doesn't mean that I'm going to do it the same way, but I think a little bit more empathy for some of the stuff that I was navigating, if I'm honest. And that doesn't mean to say that everyone has been female, because that's not the case. But I think there have been quite a few, because that level of empathy, I think, with everything that's going on.
Thanks. And Margaret?
I so agree with that point that Caroline makes about empathy. And I think there's something about not taking those knotty problems home with you, because with the best support network in the world, and I had my husband was really supportive. He didn't get it, because he wasn't immersed in the day job in a way that, I mean, he ended up defending what I was doing, and actually I would end up arguing and saying, well, actually it wasn't quite like that, arguing against myself. So I completely agree that you end up with, when you're in these lonely positions, you need people to share with, to have a laugh with, and they don't solve your problems, because the only person that can ever solve your problems is yourself. But actually you need those interactions and those close networks when you've had that oh shit moment, that you can go to them and say, what do I do now? They can't tell you, but in the end you can leave that call or that conversation knowing what it is you've got to do, and it just makes it all so much easier.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, 100%. I think Yeah, we always speak a lot about the value of support networks and kind of broad networks like this, individual closer networks, talking through challenges, issues. Yeah, we don't want finance to be a lonely place. We're all
It's
in it
leadership
together.
though, Sarah. It's not even finance, is it?
Yeah,
Finance
no,
is just the
understood.
skill set. It's the empathy of people that get it and get you.
Yeah,
And being
absolutely.
able to reach out, that confidence, back to what Caroline said at the start, the confidence to be able to reach into those people and say, can you help me?
Yeah, and they ask for help too. Agree. Thank you very much. So, it would be really great to move into the next kind of audience engagement part of our webinar today. I've been keeping a little bit of an eye on the chat, and there is a great question already here from Pat Davey. Pat, I don't know whether you're still around and happy to ask your question directly. If not, I'm very happy to ask it on your behalf, given you've already popped it in the chat, which
No,
I'll do.
that's actually fine, Sarah. Thank you. And hello there, Caroline, and to Margaret. The question is, how do you see the progression of women in the financial space, and what are some of the positive changes you've seen? Now, it sounds like a big question, but it's something that really interests me with you being where you are in finance. Thank you.
Anybody want to go first? So, progression of women in the financial space and the positive changes. Margaret, you must have some experience in this space.
You see, I suppose what I think is it's people progress, the opportunities from my perspective are far, far greater now. The understanding of the barriers, not just to entry, but to advancement, are much better understood. But there's you can't expect people to cut you more. You're still, in any career progression, you've still got to do the job. It isn't about gender. It's not about your family circumstance. You're still competing on equal terms. And I suppose my observation is people who have a sense of entitlement don't get where they want to get. You've got to be probably more resilient, fight harder to be on those equal terms, just because of some of the normalization of society. But the opportunities are there if that's what you want to take. Would be my sense, Pat. Does that resonate with your experience?
You're perfectly right. It would be good to, I mean, it's interesting to hear what you say in terms of you've really got to take it if the opportunity arises. And sometimes it's a matter of confidence for some of us, depending on where we are in our lives, in the journey in our lives, as to whether we can do that and do it in a way that it makes a difference to what we're doing in terms of our careers. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think probably what I'd just like to add to that, if that's all right, is whether it's male or female, that we're all going to have some stuff going on that means we're unable to take some of those opportunities as they come up. I think what I felt after sort of, baby years, miscarriages, was that almost people, whether this is true or not, and it could have been my reflection, but Caroline's not that fussed about her career anymore, so give up a little bit. And I think what we need to be as leaders is just aware that there are times when you might need to take a bit of a step back away. It doesn't mean that you're not going to come back to it. It doesn't mean that you're not going to come back a bit later. So let's not write people off and then enable people to take those opportunities at a subsequent point. And I think that probably would help generally, but particularly women over certain periods of time. I might be biased on that, but that's my view.
No, I agree.
So in terms of what's been positive for both of you in your journey, in terms of being female, you know, in a male dominated, I would say in inverted commas, environment, you know, what have been the one or two of the upsides for you in your quest for you know, getting where you want to be?
I think being, you know, I genuinely think actually having some of this experience and being able to talk about some of this stuff and having, and I'm not saying it's never black and white, so please don't take it as this, but you know, I think perhaps at times I can be a more empathetic leader than some others because of the experience that I've got, and I think that really helps working with others, working with teams. So I actually see it as a strength, a massive strength, but it does mean that perhaps I've gone a bit more slowly to get to this point than others may have been able to.
Thanks both of you, and thanks Pat for asking the question. Really helpful reflections. Thank you. If you've got any other questions, please raise your hand. Happy to bring in anybody that wants to ask the question directly to Caroline and or Margaret. I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well. I know Nicola won't be putting her hand up, but she has indicated a question to ask. Well, I'll read it out for you. So it's, excuse me, it's probably a little bit more for Margaret. So you referenced earlier, Margaret, you felt that you were hired into one of your previous roles because you were a skirt, and helpful to how did you cope with that when you hear kind of, you know, maybe cynical or undermining comments? What's your coping mechanism?
I don't think the people who make those observations thought that they were being undermining or cynical. I genuinely. There were two that, well, probably more than two, but two that just stand out. Right, one right at the start when I was asked at my interview to become a graduate trainee, what were my plans for a family? And when I said I had none, the borough treasurer in question lowered his glasses, they were half glasses, and looked at me and said, "And where do you think you came from?" And then the other one was when I left Coventry to become an assistant county treasurer, and the guy that gave me a presentation, and you know, and everyone was pleased for me, etc., etc. And he said, "Margaret has done so well for a woman, and she's moving on because she does so well as a woman." And you know, you just took it in your stride. But the male colleagues, interestingly, in that particular instance, said, "I felt like crawling under a desk on your behalf," you know, because they were mortified. But he didn't say it because he wanted to undermine. It was a celebratory moment. And I just think you have to have broad shoulders. You just have to have broad shoulders. It's not, and believe it's not badly meant.
Thank you.
Because generally it isn't.
I think Nicola's reaction probably says it all, but I think I hear you when you reference what's the intention, but yes, yeah. Helpful.
Oh, it doesn't mean it's acceptable, but if you get up on your high horse about all the things that are said to you that you don't agree with or whatever, it's a downward spiral. You just have to rise above it, would be my observation.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you laugh at it. I think that's the point.
Yeah, I think you have to laugh.
I mean, I with the gentleman that interviewed me, I did a presidential address at a dinner, and he was there, and I said, "Are you okay if I tell the story of my interview?" And he was. So I asked permission, and it brought the house down. It just brought the house down. So, you know, revenge is a dish best served cold.
Thank you. I'm looking through some of the questions. There's a question from Archana Patel. Archana, do you want to ask that one directly?
Yes. Thank you. Thanks, Caroline and Margaret. Really inspirational and really interesting session, and listening your stories. I have questions. What key leadership qualities do you think have helped you succeeded in NHS, particularly in such a complex and highly regulated sector? Thank you.
I think for me, bit of a combination of dogged determination, basically, to get things done and keep going. I think professionalism, so at all times, like I'm going to probably misquote Michelle Obama, but if they go low, we go high. That's definitely something that I sort of stick to on a regular basis. And I think, and I hope I'm right in saying this, but I think, you know, time for and listening to teams, which I have to admit, it takes a hit when things get really busy. But that's something that if I really recognise that if I don't do that, then that doesn't, then that's not going to lead anywhere well, basically. So taking the time to listen to teams and support teams is really key as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. The only thing I would add is it's also for me about being really clear in terms of expectations, and which it plays to integrity and values. And it's generally not, people very quickly know, maybe they don't know what I'm for, but by heck, they know what I'm against. And I think that, Archana, that's, you know, if people know where they stand, where my red lines are in terms of, you know, I'm against bad budgeting, or I'm against loss of financial control, or, you know, if they know what I'm against, it sets a framework.
Yes.
And I think that makes leadership that much more easy if people very quickly get a sense of what you're not for. What you're against, I mean, not, yeah, you can be for lots of things. Yeah, but
absolutely amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Archana. I think we've definitely got time for at least one more, maybe two more. So if there is anything else you want to ask, pop it in the chat or raise your hand. I just want to understand a little bit about just reflections, really. What is there anything you wish you'd have done differently in your careers, either of you? Sort of thinking back, and, you know, Caroline, do you still wish you'd won the Nobel Prize, or are you very satisfied now you're an accountant? Is there any things you wish you'd have done differently?
I definitely don't wish I tried to win a Nobel Prize. That would have not worked out very well for anyone, I think. I think in general, I think the answer to that is no, because, you know, everything that I've done so far has absolutely built the person, the leader, the finance professional I am today. If I was to highlight any one thing, I think I probably took a little bit too long to do that first reflection of what I wanted versus where, you know, what my values were versus where the career was. And perhaps had I have done that a couple of years earlier, maybe I'd have moved off and into something else a couple of years earlier. But, you know, in general, I think there was massive learning from that and doing that at the point at which it came. So stick with my first answer. I can also see Margaret shaking her head.
No, I'm not at all. I mean, I just think regrets are futile, and you are where you are. No regret, rien.
Mm-hmm. Very topical. Thank you. There are loads of really interesting reflections in the chat. I'm going to take a little bit of time at the end of the webinar to run through all of those. They're all really helpful, and it helps us to kind of build a picture of what the network wants to talk about and how we can shape our own set of webinars coming forwards. I'll probably start to bring this one to a close, and I'll start by saying thank you for our audience participation. Thanks for our panel members, Margaret, Caroline, you've both been amazing. There's loads of fantastic feedback for the two of you in the chat. So when you need a bit of an ego boost, you can have a look through there and see all of the massively inspiring things people have got to say and how they've benefited from your insights this afternoon. So thank you to both of you for that. As I've mentioned, we in the network are looking for ideas and themes for our next few webinars to take us through for the end of the calendar year. So if there is anything in particular that you would really like us to talk about, then drop Nicola a note, and we will do our best to weave it into a webinar going forwards. If there's any inspirational speakers you'd really love to hear from, we're very good at convincing people to be part of our panels. So please do give us your ideas and suggestions, and we'll take those forward as well. As we mentioned, we had a massively successful event over in the summer. We were met in person in London. There's about 90 or so people there at St Thomas's Hospital. It's really, really great and uplifting day. So we'll be looking to run another one of those next summer. Now we've sort of committed ourselves to doing it annually. But for today, I'm really happy to leave it there. I'll reiterate my thanks to the audience and to the panel members. We're happy to stick around for a couple of minutes informally if there's anybody else that wants to continue the discussion. But otherwise, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you all soon, and we'll hear from you soon. Thank you. Bye then.
Thanks, bye.